Hello everybody, Michael the Librarian of Magic, finding and cataloging the magical and pointing you to it. Alright friends and Star Wars fans, the time has finally come for me to unpack my thoughts about Episode 3 of The Mandalorian entitled The Sin. I've got my handy notes as always, so I'm going to dive right into discussing the episode. As always, this will be spoilery, so that's just the way my videos are at this point. Hopefully you are aware of that. Alright, so this episode, picks up where the last one left off. The Yodeling and the Mandalorian get off the planet they were on, where he found the bounty, and head back to his usual planet, where his enclave is, to turn in his bounty. On the way, there's this cute little scene where the Yodeling is fiddling with the sort of knob on top of a control lever and like untwists it, and the Mandalorian says, "Hey, that's not a toy," and they kind of have this cute little moment, which kind of comes into play later on in the episode. So that's a nice little setup. They get to their planet, and the Mandalorian, kind of a little bit to my surprise, has pretty much no hesitation about turning in the bounty. Takes the Yodeling straight away to the character that's now being officially called the Client, played by Werner Herzog, and gives him the Yodeling straight away, and gets this big old container of that Beskar steel, probably like 30 or 40 ingots worth, a big huge chunk. And yeah, there's kind of this little intense scene that you're not sure what the Mandalorian's going to do, and he sort of decides, yeah, I'm going to take the Beskar steel. So he does, and leaves the Yodeling there, and it's sort of this very sad moment. And I think that moment is, I think there are a couple of sins in this episode that the title is relating to, and I think that is the first one of them. I think there's another one later on that I'll talk about. So he takes his Beskar steel and goes back to the Mandalorian Enclave, where he delivers it to the armorer there, and attracts a bunch of attention from all the other Mandalorians there because of this huge quantity of Beskar steel that he has. And there's a very similar scene to the one that occurred in the first episode, where in this scene, instead of getting a pauldron, he uses that armor to, or that Beskar steel, to make himself, or to request an entirely new set of armor for himself, made out of Beskar steel, and to leave the remainder for the I think he calls them the foundlings, which are the young kids, the Mandalorian kids. So she gets to work making the full suit of armor, and then he has some flashbacks again to the invasion of his home planet, and those are a little bit longer. It's not quite as quick and truncated as the first episode. The way that I'm starting to understand it is that there were a couple of purges of the Mandalorians. I think this is kind of what I'm just sort of theorizing, I guess, or putting together from this episode and what I know of other Star Wars lore from the films and watching the Clone Wars TV show. They talk in this scene. So there's a character that's sort of this other Mandalorian that comes up and starts saying, "Hey, where'd you get all this steel?" And it's got the Imperial insignia on it and everything. And they're bent out of shape about the Imperials, and they give reference to something called the Great Purge that the Imperials were guilty of committing against the Mandalorians, and it's why they're in hiding and they can't show themselves out in public. And I think the flashbacks are showing a purge that was started when Order 66 occurred during the film Attack of the Clones. If you remember, Order 66 gets launched, and all of the clones turn on everybody, and the Clone Wars start, and sorry, not Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, in that time frame. And that at that time, when the Empire when the Republic starts to sort of turn more Imperial, it sort of marks the turning of them turning more Imperial. The droid armies are like beginning to execute all these people. I think that's, for some reason, I think that's what's happening in those flashback sequences. Little bit later on, when the Empire is fully the Empire, like in the era of A New Hope and stuff like that, I think that there was executed what was called the Great Purge, which was the Empire sort of trying their best to eliminate all of the Mandalorians, and many of them were, and the rest had to go underground into hiding, and that's kind of where we find them now, about 6 or 7 years after Return of the Jedi, and that's why they have such great disdain for the Empire. That's sort of my theory on all that, that there were sort of two purges or attacks on their people that happened. And there's a lot of references to other lore about that sort of stuff in this show. That's why I'm kind of putting these things together. The Mandalorians, there's a lot about them and what happened in the Clone Wars animated TV show. If you haven't seen that, and I'll say this, if you don't want to watch any other extraneous information, if you don't have the time or you don't feel like you want to, if you don't want to watch other shows or read other novels or anything like that, this show will still remain accessible to you, but they're going to probably throw things out there that aren't going to mean anything to you by the end of the show. Like, not all of your questions are going to be answered by the show, but the plot of the show will still make sense to you and the show will still be accessible to you. However, if you want to know more, if you want some of those questions to be answered, if you want to go deeper about the backstory of the Mandalorians and all that stuff, there is stuff out there. The Clone Wars show, animated show, has a lot of stuff about what happened to the Mandalorians during the time of the Old Republic and the Clone Wars and all that stuff. And if you haven't seen that, I would highly recommend checking that out, or at least the isolated story arcs that deal with the Mandalorians, if that's what you're interested in as it relates to this show. Because there's a lot of information about how their planet was trying to be pacifistic or neutral during the Clone Wars and not take a side between the Republic and the Separatists, and also about how their society was structured, how the Mandalorians were a society that had a bunch of different clans that operated with different points of view, and one of those clans was Clan Vizsla. And an interesting thing that we don't yet know about is there's a character in The Mandalorian in this episode that kind of comes, I was saying before, that kind of comes up and gives the Mandalorian some grief about, oh, you got these Imperial Beskar steel things, and they kind of like have a little like knife fight thing with each other. They have like vibroblade knives. That character has been officially revealed to be called, I think Paz Vizsla. His name is Paz Vizsla. And that may potentially be a reference to Clan Vizsla from the Clone Wars, which there's a clan called Vizsla in the Mandalorians that features really heavily, and a character called Pre-Vizsla, who was voiced in the animated show by Jon Favreau. In this episode of the Clone Wars, this character Paz Vizsla is also voiced by Jon Favreau. The only thing that's kind of murky is that officially, from what has been released, at least from what I've read, and I don't know, these things may get cleared up further on down the line. It's not like I can read the entire internet, but the name Vizsla is spelled slightly differently. I don't know if that's an error. I don't know if that's something that's in the universe where things have changed over time because they're trying to go into hiding or stuff. I have no idea. I don't know if they're connected. I don't know if they're related. The fact that they're both voiced by Jon Favreau is a little too coincidental to not mean anything, but you know how it is when you're sort of getting nerdy about these things. You may be reading too much into the stuff. I don't know yet. I'm happy to wait until more gets revealed. Anyway, my point in bringing all that up is that is what happened at this point in the plot, and also to reiterate that there's a lot of stuff that's being referenced. Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni and the people who are creatively working on this show know a lot about the lore that's come before and after this, and how to tie it in and all that stuff, and also in a way that is not necessary to your understanding of the specific plot of this show, but that sort of enhances your understanding of the deeper galactic lore of Star Wars. If you're somebody like me who wants to go a lot deeper and wants to know a lot more about, well, who's this person and where do they come from and what's their history and why are they here, you know, all those questions, there is a way to access some of that stuff. Not all of our questions have obviously been answered. That's the fun of Star Wars, in my opinion. It just keeps getting added to and added to. But Anyway, there's a lot of that stuff going on in this show, which I hope I've made clear is not necessary to understand, but will enrich in your understanding if you choose to go down that road. So, um, anyway, they have this little fight, this little skirmish, and then the Mandalorian gets his new suit of shiny Beskar armor from head to toe, and he looks really cool and awesome in it. And he's still feeling, you know, I guess disgruntled slightly about what happened. I think it's you can sort of tell that he has mixed feelings about what happened with the yodeling, and so he just wants to go get another bounty from Karga right away, the Carl Weathers character, and get out of town and just keep working. That's sort of been his MO for the first few episodes of this. So he goes back to that bar to talk to Karga. Karga tells him, "Hey, I'm not going to give you another bounty. You need to take some time to relax." And he recommends going to a Twi'lek bathhouse, which really kind of sounds a little bit like a brothel. And he says, "No, I just want another bounty right away." So he ends up getting this. He agrees to take this bounty on some Mon Calamari royal. Non Calamari, if you remember, are the same species as Admiral Akbar from the episodes like 6, 7, and 8. And he takes this thing because he knows it's going to send him far away and he can be gone for a while. So he takes the bounty, goes back to his ship, which I have now found officially is called the Razor Crest, which is a pretty cool thing. He goes back to his ship and is sitting in there getting ready to take off, and then notices the handle, sort of the gear shifter or whatever that doesn't have the knob that the yodeling took off it, and has this moment of crisis where he doesn't know if he's going to stay or go. And this is one scene that I think is really brilliant because for all the complaints that many have had about the Mandalorian never taking off his mask, and they did make a point about it earlier in the show when he was getting his armor made, that he gets asked these questions. Have you ever had your helmet taken off? Have you taken it off? Has anybody taken it off for you? He says no, it's never come off. And then they say, that is the way. That's one of their sayings. It's sort of the same thing as the Ugnaught always saying, I have spoken. The Mandalorian thing is, that is the way, this is the way, or that is the way. And so it's a big deal to not take the helmet off. And there have been some complaints about we can't really relate to the character if he doesn't have his helmet off. We can't see his face. And I kind of have thought the same thing, to be totally fair. I was kind of wondering how it would go. And this episode, I think, really allayed my fears about that, to the extent that I think his helmet will come off at some point, and I think that will be perfectly fine. But I would be totally fine if it never came off at this point, I think, because of this scene. Pedro Pascal does a excellent job of acting here, and there's an excellent job of directing here, too, where he is sort of having a moment of crisis about whether he should stay or go. And it's all very obvious, even with the mask on. It's very obvious that he's hesitating, and it's obvious what he's feeling and that he's struggling. And ultimately he makes the decision to turn the ship off, and in that moment he's going to go back and rescue the little yodeling. And this is where I believe the second sin, as I was alluding to earlier, has been committed. And that is that he has committed the sin of breaking the code of bounty hunting, because he is going back to retrieve a bounty, and he's asking questions about what might happen to that bounty, and that's not something you're supposed to do. You're just supposed to deliver it, and there's supposed to be no questions asked, and you're not supposed to, go back and make a big deal about it, but that's what he's doing. So he goes back to the client's place. He's outside, and he overhears the Werner Herzog character saying, have we extracted the necessary material yet? And they have the yodeling on this little sort of operating table. And we don't know what that necessary material is. I've read speculation ranging on all sorts of things, whether or not it's midichlorians they're trying to extract to enhance the Force in other beings or stuff like that, which is plausible, I suppose. My general leaning, without having no knowledge of what's going to happen next or anything like that, is that they're probably just trying to extract DNA or genetic material so that they can clone this being and clone more Yoda species beings. That's my guess. I have no idea what they're going to be doing, but that's sort of the direction I lean in, only because if they were just simply extracting midichlorians, midichlorians are everywhere. Lots of beings have them, and they're in other living things as well. And if that's what they're trying to do, it'd be pretty easy to harvest midichlorians without having the complicated hassle of this like bounty that has been ridiculously hard for most of the galaxy's bounty hunters to even catch up with. So I think it has something specifically to do with this Yoda being and the Yoda species and trying to clone those exact beings for whatever reason that we don't know yet. That's my thought. Anyway, then the Mandalorian infiltrates the client's facility and takes out a whole bunch of stormtroopers in the process, and then gets into the little operating room where Dr. Pershing is there, the sort of bespectacled doctory guy, who actually thinks that the Mandalorian is there to kill the Yodeling, and so right away he's yelling, oh, don't kill her, or don't kill him, don't kill it. He uses the gender interchangeably, actually, I noticed in that scene. At first he says, don't kill her, and then he says something along the lines of, I'm trying to protect him, and he uses both, which I think is just a writing thing to either make the thing genderless, and maybe it is, or maybe we don't know at this age if it takes them longer to develop a gender, or if they never do. I mean, quite frankly, we don't even know that much about how the species works. So anyway, it's sort of immaterial. It doesn't really matter. When Dr. Pershing has his head turned away, the Mandalorian sort of grabs the Yodeling and vanishes and sort of gets out of there. He gets surrounded by all of these stormtroopers on his way out with the Yodeling, and there's a sort of tense moment where you don't know if he's going to be able to get out okay, and then he uses these things called whistling birds, which were made for him from some of the Beskar steel by the armorer, and they're like these little homing darts that go into the wrist, and he sort of fires them all off in one shot. They fly around and kill or stun all of the guys in the room. So once he escapes this area with the Yodeling in tow, then the Yodeling, the baby Yoda, is back in play as a bounty, and they cut to all of the bounty hunters sitting in the cantina where Greef Karga is, and all of their little tracking beacons that they have sitting out reignite immediately, and everybody is now aware that that bounty is back in play. So as the Mandalorian is trying to escape town back to his ship, the Razor Crest, with the Yodeling in tow, he gets surrounded by everybody, all the bounty hunters in town, including Greef Karga, and they're ready to take him out, basically, to claim the bounty for themselves. And this is another one of those scenes that's super westerny. It's like a showdown in the streets at high noon. I almost, for a brief moment, the way they were surrounded and the way the scene was set up, I almost thought that the Mandalorian and Greef Karga were going to have like an actual like gunfight, like a gun duel, like Western style. And in the end, they kind of sort of do. I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, they get surrounded, and the Mandalorian decides to kind of like take a distracting shot, and everybody starts firing, and he jumps into the back of this speeder that's being driven by a droid. And it's kind of like tugging him along as he's like shooting at everybody. He gets pinned down and things look pretty dire and desperate. He's pretty much screwed. And at that point, there's this really awesome, thrilling scene where all of the Mandalorians come out of hiding at their own risk to save the Mandalorian. And they all come flying up on their jetpacks, and they all start shooting everybody, and they're all flying around, and it's super cool. And the character that was voiced by Jon Favreau, I think his name, if I remember right again, is Paz. He has this super cool, like, heavy gun, and he like looks really awesome. He's taking all these guys out. And in fact, I saw already that they're going to be making a Black Series figure of that. I'll show you a picture right over here. Isn't that neat? They're going to be selling that. That looks really cool. It's just a cool looking character, cool weaponry. Anyway, they take a bunch of people out, or at least take on fire enough to cover the Mandalorian as he's escaping to his ship. And they tell him, he says, oh, the Mandalorian tells him, you've risked hiding to come save me. And they say, this is the way, or that is the way, whatever they say. and they know that they're going to have to relocate to another planet, but that it is worthwhile to save their brother, even though he's broken the code of the bounty hunters and stuff. And I find that very interesting because it's sort of surprising that they wouldn't just reject him and say, well, he broke the code, he made his bed, he has to lie in it. But instead they all risk their security to come out of hiding. And now I'm assuming in future episodes they will be trying to relocate to another planet, and we'll see more about that. And it's very interesting, as I sort of alluded to in the first review of the first episode, that this show has quickly become not about a lone wolf Mandalorian, but about sort of the remainder of the Mandalorian peoples and what that means for them all. And I suspect we'll learn just the hints to the Vizslas. I suspect we might learn a lot more. And they've talked about things like signets. Have you earned a signet and things like that? I think they'll start talking a lot more about clans, the clan structure, the societal structure of the Mandalorians. I have a feeling we're going to learn a little bit more about that. So that's sort of some cool stuff to look forward to. Anyway, the Mandalorian makes it to his ship with the yodeling, has a final encounter with Greef Karga. Greef is ready to take him down. The Mandalorian shoots one of those carbon freezing things and unleashes all of this gas out of there. So he kind of masks his Karga's point of view. And then he shoots Karga in the chest. And Karga falls back, and the Mando is able to escape in his ship. Karga is still with us, he's still alive, because he had stashed a couple of those ingots of Beskar steel in his coat, and he was shot in the steel rather than being shot through the chest. So he was able to live, and I think he will be probably... I can't tell whether he's going to be a persistent villain or somebody who's going to be chasing the Mandalorian to be a thorn in his side, or if eventually they might come to terms and agreement. They sort of have a love-hate or begrudging respect, I think. Or at least Karga has a begrudging respect for the Mandalorian. So it's kind of hard to tell whether he's going to totally hate him or keep going after him or be a full-fledged villain or not. But we'll see. He's still around. And then the Mandalorian takes off in his ship, escapes the planet with the yodeling in tow, and we don't see where he goes from there. We'll have to wait for the next episode to find out. So it's a really cool episode. I think it's the best one that they've had so far. But I also think that it's only enhanced by the work that they did in the second episode, The Child. I think that episode was brilliant in laying the framework and the relationship between the Mandalorian and the yodeling in a short 28-minute episode, that everything that happens in episode 3, The Sin, is earned by what happened in the episode that came before it. So when he has his moments of crisis, when he goes back to rescue the yodeling, when he risks all of these things, when he risks betraying the code of bounty hunters and all of that stuff, it all makes sense. It all adds up because all of that groundwork was laid in a really beautiful and subtle way in the second episode. So I'm really liking the way that this series is being built. I'm really enjoying the story that it's telling, the interesting character that the Mandalorian is. I'm excited to know more. This was a really fun one, and I'm really happy about where they're going with this. So hopefully this was interesting to you and informative. I know I only scratched the surface on a lot of things that people probably have questions about, but hopefully I've pointed you in the right direction if you want to know more. I would encourage, like I said before, watching the Clone Wars show. I haven't gotten around to watching all of Rebels, but I'm also aware that in the animated Rebels show, there's a lot of stuff about Mandalorians in there as well. So if you're interested in Mandalorians, there's a lot of stuff out there, even on Disney Plus right now. All of that stuff is there. So I would encourage you to check it out. The stuff about Mandalorians in the Clone Wars is very interesting. There's some really cool story arcs in that show. So if you've never checked that out, I would encourage you to do that if you are the type of person like me who really wants to know more. So thanks as always for watching these. I will be back again towards the end of this week when Disney Plus releases more episodes for all their original content, including The Mandalorian. I'll make a pair of videos then. Until then, I hope you have a really excellent week. I hope this has enhanced your day and your week in some way, and that you're finding these videos very entertaining and informative. So until next time, bye-bye, take care, and we'll see you then.